15 years together is supposed to mean something, right? You think you've built this unshakable life, sturdy as a brick wall. That's what I thought my marriage with Claire was. Solid, dependable, built to last. Sure, every relationship has its ups and downs, but I always believed we had the kind of bond that could weather anything. Turns out, I was wrong. And the signs were there. Small, quiet cracks in the foundation that I ignored until they became too wide to patch. It started with her phone. Claire had always been protective of her privacy, but this was different. The phone was practically glued to her hand, and she got defensive if I even glanced in its direction. Then there were the late-night work meetings. At first, I chalked it up to her being dedicated to her job. She'd been pushing for a promotion, so I told myself it made sense. But even then, the excuses didn't sit right. I tried brushing it off. Stress, I thought. She's just tired. But her laughter grew scarce, and when we sat together, it felt like there was a wall between us. We'd gone from finishing each other's sentences to struggling to have a basic conversation. Then, one afternoon, I found it, a crumpled note in her trash bin while I was tidying up. It wasn't much, just a scrap of paper with a list scrawled in her handwriting. Find the truth. Speak openly. Stop playing roles. It hit me like a punch to the gut. What was she hiding? Was she lying to me, or to herself? My mind spiraled, but I didn't confront her then. Instead, I tucked the note into my pocket. I didn't want to give her a chance to lie or explain it away. Over the next few weeks, I became a different version of myself. Quiet, calculating, observant. I started noticing the little things, how she'd glance nervously out the window during phone calls, the way she'd stumble over her excuses when plans changed. Once, I walked in on her typing furiously on her laptop and caught her slamming it shut the moment I entered. She laughed it off, saying it was work-related, but I couldn't help feeling there was more to it. And then, the moment of truth. It was late one night when I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. Her phone sat on the counter. Forgotten. The screen lit up with a text from someone named M. I miss you. When can we meet? The blood drained from my face. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I knew in that instant that my worst fears were real. This wasn't just paranoia. It was betrayal. My Claire, the woman I thought I knew, was seeing someone else. I didn't confront her right away. Believe me, every fiber of my being wanted to grab that phone and demand answers, to force her to look me in the eye and explain herself. But what good would that do? She'd just deny it, twist the story, maybe even turn it back on me. No, I needed more than a single text to pin her down. I needed proof, something she couldn't wiggle out of. So, I waited. That's the hardest part, you know? Pretending everything is fine when every glance, every word feels like a knife in your chest. I played the role of the oblivious husband. I kissed her goodnight. I asked about her day. I even kept smiling when she mentioned those late meetings that I now knew weren't happening in any office. It's amazing what you notice when you stop talking and start listening. Her patterns became predictable. She'd step out onto the porch for phone calls, pacing nervously as she whispered into the receiver. Her overtime days conveniently coincided with nights when M sent her texts. Once, when she was in the shower, I checked her calendar on the kitchen wall and noticed a faint pencil mark on one of the weekends. Just a little X in the corner. That was the day I decided to follow her. It was a Saturday, and Claire claimed she had a work brunch downtown. She dressed like she was heading to a gala instead of a casual meal, in a navy blue dress that hugged her in all the right places. I told her she looked stunning, and she just smiled, a little too bright. Don't wait up, she added as she kissed me on the cheek. I nodded, fighting back the urge to recoil. As soon as the car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys and followed. It wasn't hard to keep up. She was always careful but not exactly suspicious of me. She drove to a cafe on the edge of town, the kind with rustic wooden chairs and ivy crawling up the walls. I parked a few spots down, far enough not to be seen, and waited. Sure enough, he was there. M, a man in his mid-40s, wearing a shop suit that screamed money. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. I stayed in the car, heart pounding, watching as they leaned in close over their coffees. At one point, his hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. That wasn't even the worst part. When they got up to leave, They didn't go their separate ways. They walked hand in hand to a nearby hotel. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the hotel entrance, trying to process what I'd just seen. There was no way to spin this. She wasn't just having an emotional connection with someone else. She was physically betraying me. The note in the trash, the texts, the excuses, all of it led to this. I felt sick. But more than anything, I felt rage. Not the kind that makes you want to yell or throw things, but the kind that simmers, cold and calculating. She thought she could play me, keep me as her backup plan while she indulged in this fantasy life with someone else. Not anymore. That night, I waited for her to come home. When she finally walked through the door, she looked startled to see me still awake. "You're up late," she said, setting her purse down carefully on the table, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice steady. "Long day?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yeah, the meeting ran over. We had so much to cover." I forced a smile. "I bet." Inside, I was already planning my next move. The days after I saw her walk into that hotel with M were some of the longest of my life. I acted like nothing had changed, but every smile, every kiss on the cheek, felt like a betrayal of myself. I spent those nights planning, gathering every piece of evidence I could. The text I'd seen on her phone was only the beginning. I installed an app to recover deleted messages and track her calls. It wasn't something I felt proud of, but it gave me the answers I needed. What I found destroyed me. They'd been meeting for months. She told him things she used to tell me, how she felt trapped, how she wanted excitement, how she needed someone who truly understood her. Reading those words felt like reliving the betrayal over and over, but I had to know the full truth. Our anniversary was coming up, and Claire always insisted we celebrate it properly. So, I booked a table at her favorite restaurant, the kind of place that was all about appearances. I dressed sharply, brought her flowers, and even ordered her favorite wine before she arrived. When she walked in, stunning in a red dress, I felt a sharp pang of loss, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. The dinner started off light. We talked about small things, our plans for the year, our son, and even shared a few laughs. She seemed relaxed, maybe even relieved, thinking everything was normal. I let her believe it, waiting for the right moment. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the note I'd found weeks ago. "You wanted honesty, right?" I said, sliding the paper across the table. Her smile froze as she stared at it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "You tell me," I replied. "It's your handwriting." Her eyes darted to mine, wide and uncertain. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "You wanted to stop playing roles, Claire. So why don't you tell me about the texts, the hotel, and M?" Her face drained of color. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but then she laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You've been spying on me," she muttered. "Don't turn this around," I snapped. "You cheated. You lied. And now you're trying to make me the villain." I reached for the final proof, the photos of her with M at the hotel, and slid them across the table. Her shoulders sagged as she stared at them. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "It never is," I replied flatly, signaling the waiter for the check. I paid the bill, stood up, and walked out, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. That night, I made another call, this one to M's wife. She was devastated, but she thanked me for telling her. I didn't feel better. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, but it gave me a sliver of control. Claire tried to talk when she got home, but I didn't give her the chance. I told her to sleep in the guest room. A few months later, I moved into my own apartment. Claire begged for another chance, saying it was a mistake and she wanted to fix things, but there was no fixing this. The trust was gone. The divorce was quiet, she kept the house. I took the car and savings. M didn't stick around. His wife left him too, and word got back to me that he lost his job. Claire still sends long emails about how she's changed, but I don't respond. For the first time in years, I feel free. No masks, no roles, no lies. I can finally live honestly, and that's something no one can take from me. Life after Claire's betrayal felt like stepping into a void. I'd spent 15 years with her, and now, everything familiar felt foreign. The house, the routines, even the silence, it all seemed hollow. The first week in my new apartment was the hardest. The place was small, sparsely furnished, and the walls echoed with loneliness. But it was mine. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. It helped, but only just. Evenings were the worst, especially the moments when my phone buzzed with emails from Claire. She sent long, rambling messages, pleading for forgiveness, saying she was lost, and that M was just a symptom of her unhappiness. One email stood out. In it, she said, "You don't know how hard it's been for me too. I never meant to hurt you." I almost laughed out loud, as if she was the victim here. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but I didn't reply. She made her choices, and now she had to live with them. What gave me a strange sense of peace was knowing I wasn't alone in this mess. M's wife and I exchanged a few emails after my initial call. She told me she'd filed for divorce and was moving back to her hometown with her kids. Hearing her strength gave me hope. If she could rebuild her life, so could I. But then came the unexpected. One evening, as I was unpacking the last of my boxes, there was a knock at my door. It was Claire. I froze, not sure whether to let her in or tell her to leave. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "I just want to talk," she said, her voice soft, almost desperate. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping the barrier between us. "There's nothing to talk about, Claire. Please," she said, tears pooling in her eyes. "Just 5 minutes." I hesitated but eventually stepped aside. She walked in, her presence filling the small space in a way that made it feel suffocating. "I miss us," she started, sitting on the edge of my couch. "I miss you. I know I messed up, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I stared at her, trying to find any trace of the woman I once loved. "You didn't just mess up, Claire. You destroyed us," I said, my voice steady. She wiped her eyes, looking down at her hands. "I was stupid. I let things get out of control. But I never stopped loving you." I shook my head, anger bubbling to the surface. "Love doesn't look like what you did. You don't cheat on someone you love, Claire. You don't lie to them for months. You don't humiliate them." For a moment, she was silent. Then she said something that stunned me. "It wasn't about you. It was about me." I felt invisible, like I wasn't myself anymore. I laughed bitterly. "And you thought sleeping with another man would fix that?" "I don't expect you to understand," she said, standing up. "But I needed you to hear it from me. I'm sorry." I nodded toward the door. "I heard you. Now go." She left without another word, and as the door clicked shut, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. For the first time since this all began, I felt like I was taking my life back. After Claire's visit, I made a promise to myself: no more looking back. I'd wasted enough time replaying every fight, every lie, every missed sign. It was time to focus on me, for once, on what I wanted, not what someone else needed from me. The first step was settling into the new apartment. It wasn't much to look at, just a small, 2-bedroom unit with a creaky floor and a view of the parking lot. But I decided to make it mine. I painted the walls, hung up a few old photos, and even bought a houseplant, despite my lack of a green thumb. Each small change made the place feel a little less empty, a little more like home. Work became my anchor. I stayed late most evenings, not because I had to, but because it felt good to focus on something I could control. My boss even noticed, commenting on how I'd become the go-to guy for big projects. It gave me a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. Outside of work, I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with over the years. One night, my buddy Mark invited me out for drinks. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready to face the world yet. But Mark wouldn't take no for an answer, and before I knew it, we were sitting at a corner booth in our favorite bar, laughing over beers like no time had passed. "You look better," Mark said, clinking his glass against mine. "A little less like a guy who's been through the ringer." I laughed, shaking my head. "It's a work in progress." He leaned in, his expression turning serious. "You know you deserve better, right? Don't let what she did define you." His words stuck with me. For so long, I'd let Claire's actions dictate how I felt about myself. But maybe it was time to let that go. A few weeks later, I decided to take another leap. There was a gym down the street from my apartment that I'd been eyeing but hadn't worked up the courage to join. One Saturday morning, I finally walked through the doors. The place smelled like sweat and determination, and I liked it immediately. The trainer, a no-nonsense guy named Chris, took me under his wing. He didn't ask about my past or why I was there, which I appreciated. Instead, he focused on the present. "This isn't just about building muscle," he said during one of our sessions. "It's about rebuilding yourself. From the ground up." Every rep, every lap on the treadmill, every drop of sweat felt like a step toward something better. I wasn't just getting stronger physically, I was reclaiming the parts of me I thought I'd lost. One day, as I was leaving the gym, I ran into someone unexpected. An old friend from college, Rachel. We'd been close once, but life had pulled us in different directions. She was standing by the smoothie bar, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking just as I remembered her. "Mike," she said, her face lighting up with recognition. "Is that you?" I smiled, surprised by how good it felt to see her. "Hey, Rachel. Long time, huh?" We ended up grabbing a smoothie together and catching up. She told me about her job, her travels, and the small business she was starting. I told her the basics about my divorce, skipping the messy details. "Sounds like you've been through a lot," she said, her voice soft with understanding. "But you're here, and that counts for something." As we said our goodbyes, she slipped me her number. "Let's not wait another decade to catch up," she joked. Walking home that day, I realized something. For the first time in months, I felt hope, not just for the future, but for myself. Just as things were starting to feel normal again, life decided to throw another curveball my way. It came in the form of an envelope Claire sent to my apartment. I found it one evening, buried beneath the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Her handwriting on the front stopped me cold. I debated tossing it in the trash, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a handwritten letter, pages long. I sat down at the kitchen table, the faint hum of the fridge filling the silence, and started to read. The letter wasn't what I expected. Claire didn't beg for forgiveness this time or ask for a second chance. Instead, she recounted the story of us, from the very beginning. She wrote about our first date, the way I made her laugh when I tripped over my words. She described the way she felt the day we bought our first house together, how proud she was to stand beside me. But then the tone shifted. She wrote about how, over time, she felt herself disappearing, becoming less of a person and more of a role. "I'm not excusing what I did," she wrote, "but I hope you can understand why I felt so lost." Lost. That word stuck with me. I'd spent so much time being angry at her, hating her for what she'd done, that I hadn't considered what she was going through. It didn't justify the betrayal, but for the first time, I started to see the cracks in our marriage more clearly. Cracks that neither of us had addressed. The letter ended with a simple plea. "I know I've lost you, but I don't want us to hate each other. For our son's sake, I hope we can find peace." I folded the letter and set it aside, unsure of what to feel. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as another excuse, but another part of me couldn't ignore the vulnerability in her words. A week later, Claire called. I hadn't heard her voice since the day I left, and hearing it now stirred something inside me, something I couldn't quite name. "I want to talk," she said, her tone cautious. "Not about us. About Luke." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked different, tired, thinner, but also more composed. "I didn't think you'd come," she said as I sat down. "I almost didn't," I admitted, my voice flat. She nodded, looking down at her coffee. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page with Luke. He's been asking questions, and I don't want to confuse him." Her words were careful, measured, but I could hear the strain beneath them. We spent the next hour discussing custody schedules, school events, and how to navigate holidays. It was awkward, but surprisingly civil. As I got up to leave, Claire reached out and touched my arm. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for meeting me. I know I don't deserve it." I didn't respond, just gave a small nod before walking out the door. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized something. Forgiving Claire didn't mean letting her back into my life. It didn't mean forgetting what she'd done. But it did mean letting go of the anger I'd been carrying for so long. Not for her sake, for mine. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finally moving on. After meeting Claire at the coffee shop, I felt a small weight lift. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. I turned my focus to Luke, pouring myself into our time together. Weekends became ours. Saturday mornings were breakfast for dinner nights, eating pancakes on the living room floor while watching cartoons, and Sundays were spent at the park tossing a football or racing on the swings. His energy was a light in all the chaos. But it wasn't always easy. One Saturday, as we built a Lego castle, he asked, "Why can't you and Mommy live together anymore?" The question hit hard, but I answered as best I could. Sometimes grown-ups don't get along the way they used to, but it doesn't mean we don't love you. He seemed to accept it, but the conversation stayed with me. I couldn't protect him from all of this, and that hurt more than I'd expected. As the months passed, I started reclaiming my life. Meeting friends, exploring old hobbies, even trying a few casual dates. One evening, Mark invited me to a get-together at his place. I almost didn't go, but when I arrived, I saw Rachel, the friend I'd reconnected with at the gym. She lit up when she saw me, and we ended up talking all night. As the evening wound down, Rachel smiled and said, "We should do this again, just the two of us." It wasn't a date, but it felt like the beginning of something. Walking home, I realized I wasn't just moving forward. I was starting to feel hopeful about what might come next. Hope is a fragile thing. It creeps in slowly, bit by bit, until one day you realize it's there, pushing you forward. That's how I felt as my days filled with more than just surviving. Luke was thriving in the shared custody arrangement, and I was finding my footing in a life that no longer revolved around Claire. But the past has a way of rearing its head when you least expect it. One afternoon, Claire called. It wasn't unusual. We'd settled into a cordial co-parenting rhythm, but her voice was shaky. "Mike, I need to tell you something," she said, pausing like she was searching for the right words. He's trying to reach out to me again." I felt my stomach drop. Of course he was. "Why are you telling me this, Claire?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Because I need you to know I didn't respond," she said quickly. "I blocked him, but I thought you should hear it from me, not through the grapevine." It took me a moment to respond. "Thanks for letting me know," I said finally. "But what you do isn't my concern anymore." She sounded hurt but didn't argue. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at my phone. Part of me wondered if she'd really blocked him or if this was her way of fishing for some kind of reassurance. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore, and for the first time, I truly believed that. Meanwhile, Rachel and I started spending more time together. It began with casual meetups, grabbing coffee after a workout or catching a late movie, but those moments felt effortless. She was easy to talk to, and being around her didn't feel complicated or heavy. One evening, after dinner at a cozy little Italian place, we walked back to her car. The night air was cool, and she wrapped her jacket tighter around herself. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said, glancing at me with a shy smile. "I've missed having you in my life." "Me too," I admitted. "It's nice to feel normal again." She stopped and turned to face me, her expression thoughtful. "You deserve normal, Mike. You deserve good things." Her words lingered long after we said goodnight. I wasn't sure where things with Rachel were headed, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. Things with Rachel were progressing in a way that felt natural, almost effortless, but life wasn't done testing me yet. One evening, while I was helping Luke with his homework, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Claire. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I sighed, already bracing myself. The email was long and emotional, a mix of apologies and confessions. What caught my attention was one line buried in the middle. "Luke's been asking questions about us, and I think he deserves to hear the truth, from both of us." I stared at the words, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to push it off as another attempt for her to insert herself into my life. But another part of me, the part that had been trying to move forward, knew she was right. Luke was at an age where things couldn't be hidden or sugar-coated forever. That weekend, I met Claire at a park near her house, Luke playing on the swings in the distance. She looked nervous, tugging at the hem of her jacket as I approached. "Thanks for coming," she said softly. "This isn't about us," I reminded her. "It's about him." She nodded. "I know. I want to make sure we do this right." We spent the next hour discussing how to handle Luke's questions, agreeing to be honest without placing blame. It wasn't an easy conversation, but for once, we were on the same page. Before we parted, she said something that stuck with me. "I'll never stop regretting what I did, Mike. But I hope someday you'll forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours." I didn't respond, just gave her a small nod before walking away. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give her yet, but I realized it might be something I needed to give myself. That evening, after dropping Luke off at Claire's, I found myself at Rachel's place. I hadn't planned on going, but something about the day left me needing her calm presence. When she opened the door, she smiled, though her eyes quickly filled with concern. "Rough day?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in. "Something like that," I admitted, sinking onto her couch. She didn't press, just handed me a glass of water and sat beside me. "You don't have to talk about it, but I'm here if you want to." It was such a simple offer, but it meant everything. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was in my corner, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely cared. As I left her apartment that night, I realized how much lighter I felt. The shadows of my past were still there, but they didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. The following weekend, Claire and I sat down with Luke to answer the questions he'd been quietly carrying. We met at my apartment, a neutral space where he could feel at ease. I made his favorite dinner, spaghetti and garlic bread, and once the plates were cleared, Claire and I exchanged a look. "Luke," I began gently, "you've been asking why Mommy and I don't live together anymore." He nodded, his big eyes shifting between us. "Yeah, I just don't get it. You guys used to laugh a lot. Now you don't even talk." Claire took a deep breath. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Big ones. And those mistakes can hurt the people they care about." He frowned, his little brows furrowing. "Did you guys get mad at each other?" I leaned forward, keeping my tone calm. "Yes, we did. But it's not your fault, buddy. And it's not something you could have fixed. Mommy and I decided it was better for us to live apart, but we both love you more than anything." Claire chimed in, her voice cracking just slightly. "And that will never, ever change. You're the most important thing to both of us." Luke stared at his hands for a long moment, processing. "Are you ever gonna live together again?" Claire glanced at me, her eyes pleading for help. I took the lead. "No, Luke. We won't. But that doesn't mean we can't still be a team when it comes to you." He nodded slowly, though I could see the confusion and sadness lingering. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That night, after Claire left, I tucked him into bed and sat with him until he fell asleep. It wasn't the kind of conversation that fixed everything, but it was honest. And that's what he deserved. As the weeks passed, Luke seemed to adapt. He still had questions here and there, but he seemed more at ease knowing the truth. I made sure to spend as much quality time with him as possible, soaking in every laugh, every game, every story. In the background, my relationship with Rachel continued to grow. We'd started seeing each other regularly, and it felt effortless, something I hadn't experienced in years. One night, as we were walking back from dinner, she reached for my hand. "I like this," she said simply, her voice soft but confident. "Me too," I replied, squeezing her hand lightly. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, just easy and real. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt like I was building something solid, something worth holding on to. As time went on, life found its rhythm. The turbulence of the past year began to settle into something quieter, something manageable. Luke adjusted well to the changes, bouncing between my place and Claire's without much fuss. He'd still occasionally ask questions about the divorce, but they came less often now, and his smile seemed more genuine. Rachel became a steady presence in my life. She met Luke for the first time at the park on a crisp fall afternoon. I'd been nervous about introducing them, unsure of how he'd react or whether it was too soon. But Rachel had a way of putting people at ease, and Luke was no exception. They hit it off almost immediately. She joined us in tossing a football, cheering for Luke's every catch like he was a professional athlete. When he tripped and skinned his knee, she crouched beside him, offering a band-aid from her purse and a few comforting words. By the end of the afternoon, Luke was laughing and teasing her like they'd known each other for years. As we packed up to leave, Luke tugged on my sleeve. "She's nice, Dad. You should keep her." His words were so matter-of-fact, I couldn't help but laugh. Later that evening, I told Rachel what Luke had said. She smiled, her cheeks turning pink. "That means a lot," she said softly. "I really like him." Hearing that filled me with a quiet kind of joy. I'd been so focused on rebuilding my own life that I hadn't realized how much I wanted Luke to see me happy, to know that life could be good again. Despite the progress, Claire wasn't completely out of the picture. Co-parenting required regular communication, and while we kept things polite, there were moments where old wounds resurfaced. One evening, as we were coordinating Luke's schedule, she brought up something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about us?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I set down the pen I was holding, unsure how to respond. "Not in the way you're thinking," I said carefully. "We had good times, Claire. But too much has happened. I've moved on." She nodded, though her expression was hard to read. "I know. I guess I'm still trying to come to terms with everything." I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed silent. The truth was, I didn't hold the same anger I once did, but I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds either. Whatever guilt or regret she carried was hers to work through, not mine. As winter approached, my life began to feel stable in a way I hadn't expected. Weekends with Luke were filled with laughter and traditions, and my relationship with Rachel deepened with each passing day. One night, as we sat on her couch watching a movie, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think you'd be here?" she asked. I looked down at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "After everything you've been through," she said, her voice quiet. "Did you think you'd find this again?" I thought about it for a moment before shaking my head. "Honestly, no. But I'm glad I did." She smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The holidays arrived before I knew it, bringing with them the kind of chaos that comes with shared custody. This year, Luke would spend Christmas Eve with me and Christmas Day with Claire. It wasn't ideal, but it worked, and we both made the most of it for his sake. Rachel joined us for Christmas Eve, and while I was nervous about how the night might go, it turned out better than I could have imagined. Luke was thrilled to have her there, and her presence added a warmth to the evening I hadn't realized I'd been missing. After dinner, we decorated cookies. Rachel and Luke quickly turned it into a competition, each trying to outdo the other with their colorful creations. By the end, the kitchen was a mess, but Luke was beaming, holding up a lopsided Santa cookie with way too much frosting. "You win," Rachel said, laughing as she handed him the unofficial trophy, a candy cane she'd pulled from the tree. Later, after Luke had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat by the tree, the room quiet except for the soft hum of holiday music. She leaned against me, her fingers laced with mine. "This feels right," she said softly, and I couldn't have agreed more. The next morning, I dropped Luke off at Claire's house. She greeted us at the door, her smile warm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Merry Christmas," she said, bending down to hug Luke. "Merry Christmas," I replied, keeping my tone light. As Luke bounded inside, Claire hesitated. "Thanks for everything you've done for him," she said, her voice low. "He's lucky to have you." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "You're a good mom, Claire," I said finally. "We're both doing our best for him." Her eyes glistened briefly before she turned to follow Luke inside. Watching the door close, I felt a pang of something. Closure, maybe. Whatever it was, I knew I'd finally reached a place where the past didn't control me anymore. That evening, Rachel and I exchanged small gifts over dinner. She handed me a wrapped box, her smile playful. Inside was a leather-bound journal. "I thought you might like a fresh start," she said. I laughed, running my hand over the smooth cover. "I'm not much of a writer," I admitted. "You don't have to be," she replied. "Just write what matters." It was a simple gift, but it felt profound. For so long, my life had been defined by what was taken from me. My marriage, my trust, my sense of security. But now, it was time to focus on what I could build. As the evening wore on, I found myself imagining the future. Not the one I'd once planned with Claire, but a new one with Luke, with Rachel, with a version of myself I was still learning to trust. For the first time in years, it felt like a future worth fighting for. The new year brought with it a sense of quiet determination. Life had finally steadied, and I felt ready to take the next steps forward. Luke settled into his routine with ease, bouncing between homes like he'd always known this was how things were meant to be. He seemed happier, lighter even, and I took that as a sign we were doing something right. Rachel became a more permanent part of my world. We spent weekends together, sometimes with Luke, sometimes just the two of us. One Saturday, we took Luke to a science museum. He ran from exhibit to exhibit, his excitement contagious. At one point, Rachel and I found ourselves watching him as he pieced together a giant puzzle on the floor. "You're really good with him," I said, glancing at her. She smiled, her eyes warm. "He makes it easy. He's a great kid, Mike. You should be proud." Hearing her say that filled me with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd worried about Luke, whether the divorce would hurt him, whether I was enough for him as a dad. But watching him thrive reminded me that I wasn't doing it alone. One afternoon, while Luke was at Claire's, Rachel and I were at my apartment, packing up some old things I'd kept in storage. As we sifted through a box of photos, she held up one of Claire and me from years ago. "You don't have to keep these if it's too hard," she said gently. I took the photo from her, studying it. It was from our honeymoon, Claire and I on a beach, both of us grinning like we had the whole world ahead of us. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for what we'd lost, but for the people we'd once been. "I don't think it's hard," I said finally. "It's part of my story, and it brought me here." Rachel nodded, slipping the photo back into the box. "Here's pretty good," she said with a small smile. It was such a simple moment, but it spoke volumes. My past didn't have to define me, and the life I was building now didn't have to live in its shadow. That evening, as we sat on the couch, Rachel leaned into me, her voice soft. "Have you thought about what's next? For us, I mean." I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because the answer felt big. "I have," I said slowly. "And I want to keep building this, whatever this is. With you." Her smile was small but full of emotion. "Good. Because I feel the same." For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back or rushing forward. I was simply here in the moment, building something new, one piece at a time. The months that followed were some of the best I'd had in years. Rachel and I grew closer, not just as a couple but as partners in every sense. She wasn't just someone I was dating, she was someone I trusted, someone I leaned on, and someone who brought a calm to my life I hadn't realized I needed. Luke adored her, and their bond only grew stronger. One weekend, while we were walking through the park, Luke tugged on my sleeve and asked, "Is Rachel going to stay around forever?" His question caught me off guard. I glanced at Rachel, who was a few steps ahead, pointing out squirrels to Luke. "Why do you ask, buddy?" He shrugged, his face serious. "Because I like her. And I think you're happier with her here." I knelt down to his level, putting a hand on his shoulder. "I like having her around too," I said. "But forever is a big word. How about we just focus on now and see where it takes us?" He nodded, satisfied with my answer, and ran ahead to catch up with her. Watching them together filled me with a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be something lasting. Things with Claire had also settled into a kind of uneasy peace. We kept our interactions brief and focused on Luke, but there were moments when the past felt closer than it should. One day, as I picked Luke up from her house, she hesitated in the doorway. "Mike, can I ask you something?" she began. I sighed inwardly but nodded. "What is it?" "Are you serious about Rachel?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. The question surprised me, but I answered honestly. "Yes, I am." She looked away, nodding slowly. "I'm happy for you," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "She seems good for you. And for Luke." "Thanks," I replied, unsure of what else to say. As I walked back to the car, Luke chatting happily beside me, I realized something. Claire's approval didn't matter anymore. It was a strange and freeing thought, one that made me feel like I'd finally turned a corner. One evening, Rachel and I sat on my balcony, a glass of wine in her hand as we watched the city lights. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked softly, echoing the conversation we'd had months before. "All the time," I admitted. "But this time, I'm not in a rush. I'm happy with where we are." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. Me too. But for what it's worth, I'm in this for the long haul. Her words stayed with me long after the night ended. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't need them. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. It was a warm spring evening when everything seemed to come full circle. Rachel and I had planned a quiet dinner at my apartment, and Luke was with Claire for the weekend. The windows were open, letting in the scent of blooming flowers, and the soft hum of music played in the background. After we ate, we moved to the couch, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing. There was an ease between us, a comfort that felt as natural as breathing. At one point, Rachel reached over, taking my hand in hers. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Do you ever stop to think about that?" I smiled, looking down at our intertwined fingers. "I don't know if I've thought about it that way. But yeah, I guess I have." "You're not the same man I met at the gym," she continued. "You're stronger now. More yourself." Her words hit something deep inside me. She was right. I wasn't the same man. Not the one who had been broken by betrayal, nor the one who had stumbled his way through the aftermath. I'd rebuilt myself, piece by piece, and while I still carried scars, they no longer felt like weights holding me down. A few weeks later, Luke and I spent the day at the park, tossing a football back and forth. As we packed up to leave, he turned to me with a thoughtful look. "Dad, do you think Rachel will come with us to the beach this summer?" he asked. I paused, considering his question. "I think she'd like that. Do you want her to come?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, she's fun. And she makes you laugh more." I ruffled his hair, smiling. "Then I'll ask her." That night, I did just that. Rachel lit up at the invitation, her excitement infectious. "I'd love to go," she said. "Thanks for asking me." It was such a small thing, a trip to the beach, but it felt like a step toward something bigger. As summer approached, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, they had all been part of the story, but they weren't the whole story anymore. They were just chapters in a book that was still being written. The day of the beach trip arrived, and as we stood by the shore, watching Luke build sandcastles, Rachel slipped her arm through mine. "Think this is what they call a happy ending?" she asked with a teasing smile. I shook my head, smiling back. "Not an ending. Just a new chapter." As I looked out at the waves, with Luke's laughter ringing in the air and Rachel by my side, I knew I'd finally found my peace. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine, and that was enough.